All right. Good morning and welcome, everyone, and to some of you, good afternoon. This is Beyond Compliance. Here it's May already, 2021, getting into the full swing of spring. My name is Aaron Bolshaw, and I'm with SafetyChain Software. And today here on Beyond Compliance, we're talking about intentional adulteration, and these inspections and the quick checks are starting to resume. So we wanted to make sure everyone had a quick primer on this. And so we're going to get into this right now. Lots to cover, but very quickly, SafetyChain, the sponsor here, is the #1 plant management platform trusted by over 1,500 manufacturing facilities to improve yield, maximize productivity, and ensure compliance. And we're scheduled for about an hour today. If you don't know, Beyond Compliance is a periodic industry update for process manufacturers. The goal, pretty simple, just bring you guys some insights around the market that shape the way we grow our businesses, deliver quality products to customers, and safeguard our brands, all while improving yield and continually going after better productivity. Of course, sometimes this is in the safety realm. So with that, we do want to hear from you. If you have some questions, we're going to save some time at the end of the presentation to get to them. But give us those questions in the webinar console. It should be on the right side of your screen for everyone that's joining us today. So, the answer to everyone's favorite question, of course, is yes. Everyone at the conclusion of this presentation will get a link to the recording and the slide deck and everything like that, so that you guys can kind of take this information back with you into your plans. My speaker today, he's joined us a few times, Christopher Snabes from the Ashton Group, familiar friend to us on FSMA Fridays, and really it's one of a handful of lead instructors for the vulnerability analysis component of food defense plans. He's a certified food scientist and food microbiologist with loads and many, many years of experience in and around the food world and food safety in particular. Chris, welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Yeah, all right. Well, Chris, imagine, if you will, I'm going to start off the top. I'm thinking there's going to be some people on the line that haven't been through one of these quick checks, or it's been a while, and one of these inspections. And without getting into the options of how you do this, you'll get to that later, right? What does this look like? Do we get a fair warning? Do we understand when the quick check is going to happen? How much time is given, right? What kicks off that process?
Well, great question, Aaron. And in general, when the FDA comes to your facility, at the end of their reason for being at your facility, whatever it is, could be for a FSMA assessment, it could be for a GMP assessment, it could be a for cause. At the very end of that, they're going to spend about 10, maybe 15 minutes with you, just asking a quick series of questions regarding food defense and where you stand. And I'm going to give you some examples of what some typical food defense questions could be as part of that quick check. And that'll come at the end of this presentation after we discuss just exactly what you need to have in your food defense plan and how do you do it.
So you're saying you won't really know that this is happening. They're going to show up and they're just going to say, okay, it's time. We're going to do this quick check, right? So you got to be able to find your information pretty quick to give them and to make that a smooth process, I'd imagine.
Initially, it's just going to be a discussion, a simple one-on-one discussion with either your food defense qualified individual or your PCQI or some representative within your facility.
Okay, got it. Well, why don't you start us off to today's discussion? You got a ton of really good stuff. Why don't you get us going, Chris, and I'll be monitoring the questions. We'll get to those a little bit later, okay?
Thank you. Whenever we teach different people within a TAG and who join TAG to learn about the intentional adulteration rule, I always like to throw out this little poster that you see on your screen. And this is actually a newspaper ad taken out during the early parts of World War II. And at that time, the United States needed a workforce stateside to actually make products to ship to our servicemen overseas. And one of those products, as you can imagine, is food. And this newspaper ad, I blew up a little tiny line that's buried in it. And it says, "Food is the mightiest weapon of them all." And the reason why I like to point that out is I like to say, What was true back then in the early 1940s is even more true today. Food is the mightiest weapon of them all. And the reason why I say that is because there are bad people out there. They could be an inside person, it could be an individual, it could be a group of terrorists who want to use food against us to cause mass harm. And the whole importance of the intentional adulteration rule is trying to reduce that potential of mass harm against the American people. And so with that in mind, setting the stage of why we have this rule, I'm going to go over a little bit about the rule and how you apply your vulnerability assessment. Some basics about the intentional adulteration rule. It recognizes that the greatest threat to our food supply truly is from an inside attacker. And somebody who has legitimate access to your site. It covers domestic facilities as well as facilities outside of America. So if you work for a company or you import food from a company from outside the United States, they too have to have a written food defense plan that meets the intentional adulteration rule. It can't just meet one of their quote-unquote GFSI type food defense checks and points. It's different. The intentional adulteration rule deals specifically with the inside attacker, and those GFSI type plans typically do not deal with the inside attacker. It covers food that normally we don't think about being covered underneath FSMA, such as low acid canned food for microbiological hazards. That has to be included now. Seafood HACCP, juice HACCP, dietary supplements, and bottled water. They also have to follow this rule. They were required to be written and in place for everybody except for very small businesses. Small businesses now have until July 26th of this year. After that date, every food facility needs to have a written food defense plan. One point I like to make everybody aware of is that a food defense plan is site-specific. Just like a food safety plan is site-specific, your food defense plan is site-specific. So if you're a corporate entity and you have 15, 20, or 6 different facilities across the U.S., each one has to have its own written food defense plan. What I'd like to show you now is a little bit, I'm having trouble, there we go, of the how the rule is set into place for those of you who are familiar with HACCP. What you see here is a flow chart, a circular flow chart that has a lot of analogy to how food HACCP is. So if you're familiar with food HACCP, then this should be kind of familiar to you as well. You'll see that at the top there, we need to have a written vulnerability assessment, and that includes training. So you have to be an FDQI. Now, similar to HACCP, this would be analogous to your hazard analysis. Okay, an analysis has to be written. From there, if you identify hazard, or in our instance for food defense, a key activity type, you have to call it out, and then you have to figure out how you need to control it. So analogous to a HACCP plan, you would call that a CCP, or preventive control plan, you call it a PC. Here, under food defense, we're going to call those actual process steps that need something to control a hazard, okay, or a vulnerability. From there, you implement your mitigation strategies, such as a process preventive control, if you would, for a preventive control plan or a CCP. And as you can imagine, along with your HACCP plan or your FSMA food safety plan, your food defense plan also includes food defense monitoring, food defense corrective actions, food defense verification, and of course, reanalysis. And all along the way, everything has to be documented. So there's a lot of analogies to the IA rule compared to the FSMA plans or basic HACCP plan. One of the key components of the food defense rule, which is a little bit different than other rules under FSMA, is that there's different segments of the rule where you can be trained. And you can become a qualified individual for a certain portion of the rule or every portion of the rule or any combination thereof. And I'm going to go over these different types of training. The first is a general overview of the IA rule, what it is, what it entails, why it was written. And it's a free course. Everybody loves free. It's online. It's on the FSPCA website. The next course you could take is called Food Defense Awareness Training. Now, this is also free. And this is the type of training that's actually the only training that's called out in the rule that's required. This rule is required to be trained to any person who works at an actionable process step, or an APS, and their immediate supervisor. They also have to know what to do if an unauthorized person comes into that area, and what kind of mitigation strategy would have to be applied. So that's the one type of training that's actually required. They have to take it, and it has to be documented that they have taken it. It's free. You can take it on the FSPCA website, and they can give you a certificate as well for that. The next type of training is the CAT training, Key Activity Type Training. This is also an online course, or you can have different consultants teach this as well. It's free online, and it can come with a certificate if you pay a fee. So you could take it for free without a fee, no certificate. If you pay the fee, you get a certificate. The next type of training, boy, my slides are so sensitive, my apologies. Is the mitigation strategy training. The mitigation strategy training is also another course that is on the FSPCA website. You can take it without paying a fee, and you don't get a certificate. If you pay the fee, you do get a certificate, and it tells you what to do, or gives you some ideas of what to do to put in place if you find an actual process step. In other words, what could you do to either prevent or reduce the likelihood of that step being attacked by an inside attacker? The next type of training is very specific, and this is the vulnerability assessment training using the 3 elements. We're going to go over just what those 3 elements are later in this presentation, but it can only be taught by a lead instructor who knows how to teach you the vulnerability assessment using the 3 elements. It is currently being taught virtually only until August 31st. After August 31st, unless there's an extension by the FSPCA, it's going to go back to in-person training only, okay? So this training is not offered on the FSPCA website. It's very specific training. The next set of training, or the last set, is we call the Food Defense Plan Preparation and Reanalysis. Again, you could take it online for free, but you don't get a certificate. If you pay the fee, you do get a certificate. And it tells you how to put it all together, and tells you how to implement your monitoring, food defense monitoring, food defense corrective actions, food defense verification, and when it's time to reanalyze your food defense plan. So as I said, you can become a food defense qualified individual in any one of these little subsections, or all of them, or any combination thereof. What's kind of neat about that is you can actually have different people within your company take QI training for just a certain part of the role and have them do their expertise, and then come together at the end and write your food defense plan as a whole based on their observations and results. You can also take this training or be qualified through other ways than through the FSPCA. So if you have a lot of on-the-job experience, you've taken some educational courses in this through other areas that meet the requirements of the FSPCA and the FDA as far as what the minimal amount of knowledge is that you need, you could also be deemed qualified, but it must be documented. Now, before your plan is written, there are some background things that are highly suggested, okay? You don't have to have a couple of these, but it really helps out. And then is to have a food defense team with multiple backgrounds. So just like your food safety team, you have somebody from QA, somebody from production, somebody from maintenance, somebody from sanitation. You want the same kind of team or a similar team on your food defense team. However, there is an individual that's strongly suggested that's also on your food defense team that's typically not on your food safety team. And that's somebody from human resources. And we're going to talk a little bit later why having somebody from human resources is a nice component to be on your food defense team. The next thing to have is a process flow chart. Almost every single facility I've ever been to already has a flow chart in place. So that's not a hard thing to come up with. Determine who's going to be the qualified individual per topic, and I just went over all those subsections, who's going to be the FDQI, and then write your vulnerability assessment. So the food defense rule is pretty specific. You have to have a written vulnerability assessment no matter what you do. And the vulnerability assessment will tell you whether you even need a full written food defense plan or if you can stop at that point. And the intentional adulteration rule has lots of flexibility, and there's many ways to determine how you can do your vulnerability assessment. One of them is simply by determining your key activity types. And for those of you who don't know what those are, there's 4 of them. There's bulk liquid receiving and loading, liquid storage and handling, secondary ingredient handling, mixing, and similar activities. So those are the 4 key activity types. Now, let's see here. Conducting your vulnerability assessment is based on the CAT only. So you can do your vulnerability assessment just by going through your flow chart and say, does this process step meet the true definition of one of those 4 CATs? Yes or no? And it's a valid way to do it. And a lot of companies that I've worked with have done that. And they said, okay, of all of my 35 processing points, I have 6 CATs. Now that I have identified 6 key activity types, I will now write my food defense plan and implement mitigation strategies for those key activity types I've identified, and then I'll implement food defense monitoring, food defense corrective action, food defense verification. It's simple, it's easy, does not take a lot of time, and you don't have to have somebody trained in the vulnerability assessment using the 3 elements. Okay, so it's less consuming time-wise. However, there's a con to that. So the drawback to that, or I should say the downfall to that, is that no matter what CAT you identify, it automatically becomes an actual process step. So if you have an actual process step, that kicks in further requirements. So just think it means more work, right? It could increase the number of actual process steps unnecessarily, which would increase your mitigation steps. When you have to implement a mitigation strategy, sometimes that costs a lot of money. Sometimes it's a simple strategy where it doesn't cost hardly any money. You can use an existing process within your facility to act as a mitigation strategy. But it could increase the number of mitigation strategies unnecessarily. And so the more work you have, as you can imagine, there's more documentation, more time, more review. It might be unnecessary. But you can do your vulnerability assessment just based on CATs. It's simple, it's easy, it's quick. Okay, here. Option 2.
Do you want me to jump in there, Chris?
Yeah, if you want to take care of it.
Yeah, just let me know when you want to go. No worries. I'll take over. So we're on option 2.
Option 2.
Go for it, bud.
So you can do what we call a vulnerability assessment at each processing point, process step, point, or procedure, using the 3-element approach, okay? Now, the 3-element approach is pretty cool because you can actually score, we can put a numeric to each process step, and based on that score, you can determine, is it truly an actual process step, okay? Next slide, please. The 3 elements that you score have, we call them element 1, 2, and 3. Element 1 is what we typically would call a criticality point. And then it's the potential public health impact, such as the severity scale, if a contaminant was added at that specific point, step, procedure. You're just scoring that specific point, step, procedure. What would be the public health impact? How much mass harm could be done if a bad person were to put some kind of contaminant at that step, point, or procedure? Element 2 is actually you're scoring the access to the product. Is there ease of the bad person being able to put something into that process step? You get to score that. Or is there something in the way, what we would call an inherent characteristic, preventing a bad person from somebody putting something into that step, point, procedure at that spot? And you take that in consideration when you score. The third score is what we like to call the vulnerability, meaning just how likely is it for a bad person to put enough content, shall we say, or enough component into that step to actually cause mass harm. Could the bad person have to put in, say, just a little bit of product or a lot of product? Would they have to climb a ladder, or could they simply just walk on by and drop it in when nobody's looking? So that's what we call the vulnerability. Now, the other nice thing about this approach for element 1 is you actually have options on how to score element number 1. So the FDA has given us 3 options. We can do it by volume of food at risk, which is actually fairly simple, could be complex to do, but in general, it's not that hard. We can use a representative contaminant approach, and that's the default number that the FDA has come out with, and they will tell you what that number is when you take the course. And it takes into effect many, many potential contaminants as an average. It's not a specific contaminant volume, but as an average. And it's real simple to do. The next approach is contaminant specific. Now, this one is very, very complex, and it assesses every known potential contaminant dose at each step, which is very complex, okay? I have worked with some clients who actually are using this approach. They typically have an in-house, on-staff, full-time toxicologist, and this is a very complex way to do it. However, it's very specific, and it is an option. So the FDA gives you 3 ways just to score element 1, the potential public health impact. Next slide, please. So what are the pros of using the 3-element approach? Well, it's the scale. The scaling system, or the scoring system, is predetermined by the FDA. They give you flexibility using element 1, as I stated. When you use the representative contaminant approach, the FDA recognizes the default factor in element 1 for you. It's very thorough and includes the use of inherent characteristics. Inherent characteristics are nice to know because that could exclude a cat from becoming an APS, an actual process step. So that's the benefit of one of the good benefits of using this approach. What are the cons? Well, you have to take the IABA course so you can get a better understanding of how to apply this option. You could just read the rule directly and then apply it. However, it might be kind of difficult without an instructor giving you some examples of how to do that. There is a minor fee for it as well. It's not for free. You must have a detailed explanation of why or why it is not an actual process step based on your score, okay? You have to justify in writing if you use a different scoring scale. So if you use your own scoring system, which you could do, it's going to be kind of difficult. You're going to have a very good justification why you use your own scale, and you have to be able to explain it to the FDA, and the FDA has to somehow say, okay, we accept that reasoning. But you do have that option. I have not met a client yet who's done their own scaling system. Not to say that it's somebody out there who's not. I just have not personally run across that yet. Let's see. The other con is you might not even realize that there could be a potential contaminant out there that you have not assessed. So if you're using the contaminant-specific approach, you really, really, really got to be thorough to make sure that you have looked at every potential contaminant. This would be on the next slide. I'm sorry. This would be on the cons. Yes, thank you, Aaron. So that's one of the cons of using the 3-element approach. If you're going to use the contaminant-specific approach, you really got to keep up to date on all potential hazards that are out there. And again, there might be some that we don't know about that the FDA and Homeland Security does know about. Next slide, please. The hybrid. So the hybrid is my personal favorite approach to assessing a facility, whether or not they have any key activity types that become an actual process step. It's really easy to do, and it's quick to do. And what you do is you go through your flow chart. You initially find your key activity types based on those 4 types, and then you score just those key activity types. And from there, you can determine whether or not the key activity types is an actual process step. So you've skipped the, I guess you would say, the review of each point, step, and procedure by just reviewing just the cats, So it can actually save you some time. And it's pretty good. It works great. I've worked with a lot of companies that have used this approach, and they found it to be very successful. Again, what are some of the cons if you use the hybrid approach? It's hard to do if you haven't taken the IAVA course. It's hard to understand how it's applied. If you use a contaminant-specific analysis, you might not realize all the modes of potential contamination. So typically we say we will use the contaminant representative for scoring. And other than that, the hybrid vulnerability assessment has been very successful with a lot of companies I worked with. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you some examples of companies that I've worked with who have used who've used different ways to apply this rule. And the first example is a company that I worked with who had a lot of key activity types, and they were trying to figure out, well, can I reduce that? And what they did was they produced several drink products, and they had 85 processing steps. And of those, they identified 17 cats. And they were ready to go ahead and say, okay, we're going to apply 17 mitigation strategies and management components. And they realized, boy, that's a lot of work. So some of the proposed mitigation strategies actually involve relocating processing equipment. And if you're familiar with the drink industry at all, so you can imagine rearranging a bunch of pipes, vats, distillation equipment, pasteurization equipment. It would have been a lot of time and money spent. So they asked TAG to give it a quick review. And so we reviewed that. Initially, we said, well, using a key activity type in and of it by itself, that's acceptable. You could do that. However, we suggested, we think you could probably reduce the amount of key activity types if you were to apply the 3-element approach. And they did. And they went from 17 to 4. So just imagine that. You just saved 13 mitigation strategy steps from your food defense plan, which means there's 13 key activity types that are no longer APS, which means you no longer have to do any management components for those other steps. You only have to worry about those 4. And that actually freed up a lot more money in that facility as well. Next example. So axial process step versus no axial process step. So TAG's worked with a flour mill, and they also used the hybrid method. They went through, and they had 122 processing steps, and they said, well, we're just going to look and see which one of those are cats only by definition, and they identified 29 cats. After they scored each of the 29 cats using the 3-element approach, guess what? They found out not a single one, not one, scored high enough to become an actual process step. Well, that was great news, because if you have no actual process steps and your written justification is why, you do not need a written food defense plan. You only have to have your written vulnerability assessment as proof that you went through and you looked at all of your facility point steps and procedures. Now, as you can imagine, if they didn't have to implement any mitigation strategies, that meant they did not have to implement any management components, which means they didn't have to spend any money, any time. They didn't have to do any documentation. All they're required to do is reevaluate once every 3 years. So it was a very great exercise for them, and they actually freed up a lot of money that they could use for other parts of their facility. Next example. So processing steps. So I said a lot about key activity types. And knowing what your key activity type is paramount for you to understand whether or not you have to either further evaluate it or if you're going to apply it into an actual process step. So I worked with a company. It was a ready-to-eat food company. And they actually, when I was reviewing their plan for them, they actually missed a step that they thought was not a key activity type. And we had to go back and remind them what the true definition is of all 4 key activity types and give examples. In this particular example, they had a solid food product, and it was in bulk quantity, and it was actually exposed to a flush of oil for 2 minutes. They assumed that since that the oil flushed in and out, that the solid food remaining could not be adulterated. So that was a misunderstanding or misinterpretation of one of the key activity type definitions. This is a classic example of what we call mixing similar activities. So you really, really have to be sure that you identify all your key activity types in your facility before you move on to any next steps. And this emphasizes the point that you clearly have to identify them. You have to identify them on your flow chart and clearly describe the processing step, regardless of what the vulnerability assessment you take. And your written justification is needed to support your reasoning. Next slide, please. Reanalysis. So similar to a food safety plan, the food defense plan must be reanalyzed a minimum of once every 3 years, or for any of the following reasons. Whenever there's a significant change that creates the potential for a new vulnerability or a significant increase in one previously identified, when there is new information about potential vulnerabilities associated with a food operation or facility, when a mitigation strategy is not properly implemented, and whenever the FDA requires reanalysis to respond to new vulnerabilities, credible threats, or developments in scientific understanding. Next slide, please. So what are your next steps for your food facility? Well, currently, you actually have an option where you can use the Food Defense Plan Builder. It's version 2.0. It's an electronic system that's on the FDA website, and it's fully aligned with the rule, and it can allow you to upload any information you had if you happen to use version 1.0 way back when. Version 1.0 is not aligned with the rule, so those facilities that think they're okay because they got version 1.0, you got to go back and now you got to do version 2.0. Don't wait. The FDA is expecting you to have a written food defense plan in place. The majority of all facilities now can expect what we call a quick check. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And very small businesses will have to fulfill the rule requirements by July of this year. So after July of this year, all food and drink facilities will need to have a written food defense plan. Now, quick check inspections is going to be a simple set of questions, and they're going to last, or the quick check style or emphasis will last for as long as the FDA deems necessary for the industry as a whole to understand this concept. The FDA is going to emphasize that they will educate before they regulate. And if you go to the next slide, I'll give you some more information on FDA's inspection strategy. And currently, the reasoning is they're going to have a two-tiered inspectional approach. First, they're going to do what they call the Food Defense Plan Quick Check, and it's going to be conducted in all covered facilities. It has a very low burden on the agency and the industry, and at the time will require very little training for the investigators. So the investigators, they're actually just going to ask you a couple questions. They're going to take notes. They just want to see where you stand in relation to the rule. Once time goes by, and we don't know how much time that's going to be, comprehensive inspections will begin. And initially, it's going to be conducted on only a limited number of prioritized facilities. We don't know what that prioritization is. That's based on internal FDA information. It's going to focus inspection resources on where they believe the intentional adulteration concern is the highest. There will be specialized training for those investigators. They're going to do a very detailed review and assessment of your written food defense plan. To date, I've only run across a single notation where one facility was inspected per the IA rule. And the results of that inspection, and whether it was voluntary request or for cause, I don't know. I don't know the reasoning for that. The quick checks are expected to occur at the end of any other FDA inspection or any other reason why the FDA is there. It could be for a FSMA assessment. It could be for a GMP assessment. They might be there for a juice HACCP assessment. They might be there for cause. Let's say you were in a recall or following up on a recall. At the very end, they're just going to ask you a simple set of questions. And if you go to the next slide, I'll give you an example of what some of those questions will be. Now, there could very well be other questions. This is just a sampling of questions that they could ask you. And the first one is, do you have a written food defense plan? Was it written by a food defense qualified individual? Did you conduct a vulnerability assessment? Have you identified any caps? Did you choose the option of using a three-element approach? Have you considered the possibility of an inside attacker? That's a really important question to ask Because again, I go back to those facilities who are depending on their GFSI type audit, where food defense is mentioned and discussed, and those audits do not take into account the inside attacker. Other questions they can ask: have you implemented any mitigation strategies? Has it been signed and dated? Do you have any corrective actions in place? How are you verifying? Have you had a food defense incident? And if so, did you contact the FBI? And that's an important thing too, because the FBI will then take over the case if you do have an intentional adulteration event, because that's a criminal act, okay? And the intent was to cause mass harm. So they will get involved at that point. And again, there could be a whole slew of other questions that they might ask you, but these are just a typical example of some that they could ask you. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and Chris, this is just an interjection here. There is a little bit more you can get on SafetyChain.com/quick checks. Just download that free infographic if you want a little something else to go off of. But yeah, all right, continue. This is very interesting, and we've got a lot of great questions coming in, Chris. So go.
Good. Well, for closing thoughts, facilities need a written vulnerability assessment. Again, there's several options to do that to determine whether or not you even need a written food defense plan. If an actual process step is identified, then the mandatory food defense awareness training is required for the worker and their immediate supervisor. Based on the results of the vulnerability assessment, a written food defense plan can then be created. More than one individual can become trained as a qualified individual, as the rule has several components that require specialized training. These QIs can then work as a small team to help write the food defense plan. Food is the mightiest weapon of them all. One other thing I want to add here that I didn't mention earlier, and this was in regards to the human resource person. Part of your mitigation strategies might be to employ what we call a trusted individual, somebody who's worked at the site for a while, has a good work history, no known issues. And typically the only person or very few people who know that kind of information is somebody from human resources. So it's nice to have somebody from human resources who can gather that information upon request by the food defense team, whether or not if X person could be considered a trusted individual to work at an actual process step. And with that, I'm ready to take any questions you have.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I've got a bunch myself, but no, I'll get to some questions coming in. We did have a couple questions, Chris, about the difference between FDQI and PCQI. I had the similar question myself that I wrote down, but Marcus asked, to be FDQI, do you need to undergo a formal or formula training course similar to PCQI?
So that's a great question. So a food defense qualified individual is not equivalent to a preventive controls qualified individual. Just like human food PCQI is not the same as an animal food PCQI. They're not the same. In order to become a food defense qualified individual, you have to take the training that's offered per different division of the IA rule or bucket. So, for example, you can be a QI, FDQI, and just CATS. You can be an FDQI and just mitigation strategy. You could be an FDQI and just applying the 3 elements. You could be an FDQI in doing the reanalysis and the writing of the plan. Or you could be an FDQI who does all of those. You just need to have all that training. So if you're PCQI trained only, you are not qualified unless you have some other training. But PCQI training only does not qualify you as a food defense qualified individual.
Got it. Thank you very much. I was wondering if there was some material differences, and I figured there would be quite considerable differences. And this just leads us to have a lot more, letters after our names. When you go into our LinkedIn account, PCQI, FDQI. So good. Thanks, Chris.
Alphabet soup.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So a couple of questions came in about the FDA Food Defense Builder tool. So I'm going to try and combine these two, Marcus again and James here. So Marcus asks, is version 2 the best tool to be using in helping build the food defense vulnerability assessment and food defense plan. And the other question was, does it make the food defense builder tool obsolete? So can we go back and just kind of recover what your guidance would be on using the defense builder plan?
So I've used it. I've played around with it. I've assisted a company who did use it. It's fully aligned with the rule, so it works great. You have to have a lot of things in place before you start filling in all the blanks. So you would need access to your existing written food safety plan, and you would actually use a lot of components of that to help write your food defense plan. The more complex your processing is, and the more different types of foods, meaning they would have different key activity type areas, the more difficult it is to use it. So, and not to say that it won't work, because it will. It's just a little bit more clunky. So the simpler process you have, the easier it is to use the Food Defense Plan Builder software that the FDA provides. Other ways to do it is you can look, once you take the trainings, you'll see that there's guidance documents that are mentioned. In the guidance documents for this rule, and there's 3 different sets of guidance documents, there's actually blank forms that the FDA created that you can use to write your food defense plan and to do your vulnerability assessment. So there is materials out there that you can use. So you have options.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, because James went on to say he didn't recall the CAT concept being mentioned in the tool. Is it in version 2, the CAT concept?
Yes, it is. Yep, it's fully aligned.
Okay.
With the rule.
Got it. Okay. So another question here: if your facility hasn't gone through a quick check, is it guaranteed you will go through one? Yes or no?
Sure.
Is that accurate?
Well, that's a great question. So when this rule was first starting to go live, when the larger facilities had to register and have their plans in place, we had this thing called COVID-19 hit. And because of the pandemic, a lot of the on-site inspections have dramatically been reduced. There have been a few, but not a lot. So because of that, there has not been a lot of quick checks performed at food facilities because there haven't been a lot of on-site inspections done by the FDA. I am presuming that once we get back to some sense of normalcy and we have a lot of on-site assessments being done again by the FDA, the quick checks are going to resume. And whether or not you get a quick check will depend whether or not the FDA comes on site.
Yeah. Got it. All right. One more opinion-based, I think, question here for you to follow up with that one on the quick check. Will there be non-conformances come out of these questions, or more kind of like learning type situations?
Oh, that's a great question. It's strictly going to be learning, and the FDA is going to take their time with this rule because this is a whole new concept for the industry, and it's a whole new concept for the FDA as well, and they realize that. And they realize that the learning curve for this is much longer than, say, the parental controls rule. So they will give you information, handouts. They'll give you information where to find additional training. So no, it's just pure. The quick checks are just going to be purely educational, and that's why the people performing the quick checks are not going to be as highly trained as the people who are going to do the actual assessment when they do a food defense assessment. So it's just meant to be just a casual conversation, from my understanding, and they just want to gather some basic information to see how is the industry doing. Are they ready? Are they even ready for full enforcement? Yes or no? And in the meantime, they're just going to, if you don't know, you don't have the right answer, that's okay. They're going to give you training information, how to get that information, and how to perform your assessment.
Yep, got it. Good. So going back to the mitigation of, is the process, I'm trying to re-synthesize this question for you, Chris, is the process of what to do when an unauthorized person enters that area, right? So when we're talking about understanding what you need to do if somebody wanders in, right? Does that process need to be auditable? Is that a document that you have to be able to share with the FDA that says, hey, here's our process for mitigating that strange person walking in.
Yes. So yes, that is part of your management components. So as part of your food defense verification and part of your mitigation strategy. So if your mitigation strategy, for example, is to escort somebody out of the area because they weren't supposed to be there, you're supposed to tell your immediate supervisor, and then it has to be documented. And then you need to review and say, now, how did that person get in there? What can we do to prevent that from happening again? So that'd be a corrective action. That has to be documented. And every step along the way, those documents have to be maintained and reviewed. And so, yes, that definitely has to be done.
Got it. Okay, great. Another question here. I think we're close to wrapping it up. I had a question come in about sort of the mitigation for the APS CAT. So can you run a CAPA? Is that something that's considered to be like, hey, is that sort of best practice to run a CAPA for running mitigations from the APS CAT only? So if you use APS CAT only, right, and you have to run through the process, is a CAPA good enough corrective and preventative actions? Demonstrate that.
If you have a key activity type and you're only doing the key activity type method, you have to implement. It automatically becomes an actual process step, and then you implement a mitigation strategy. Typically, when you run a CAPA is done when something has failed. Now, you can have your corrective action policy in place that includes doing a CAPA to see why it failed. But that's usually when you apply a CAPA.
Okay, got it. Very good. Let me scroll through these here real quick. Oh, hey, here we got another one come in just could you please explain the CAT secondary ingredient handling and provide maybe an example of that?
Yes. So think of a processing facility where you have humans physically weighing an ingredient. And let's say they're making a pre-batch for a day's production. Maybe say they're making a pre-batch of spices. So they take a little bit of this ingredient, that ingredient, and they are adding them up and making, say, a batch of spices to be used for that day. That is secondary ingredient handling. And mixing would be they would take that bag of spices and they manually dump it into a vat. Okay, that's a processing step. Those are typical key activity types under mixing and similar activities. Great question.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. All right. Well, let's see here. I think we kind of came to, there's a few more things online that everyone should be aware of. Of course, there's plenty of resources at the Atchison Group. Please go get their newsletter. It is jam-packed. I read it every time. You guys do a great job there, Chris. We do have a lot more resources on SafetyChain. Join FSMA Friday if you haven't. It's a LinkedIn group out there. Join the fun. And we've got a few things coming up, a few more. So we've got proactive internal auditing May 12th. We also have a couple weeks after that, making sense of FDA's reportable food registry. And then we kind of get into some costs of poor quality. We're looking at making this a two-step webinar. So there's a lot of stuff going on. Keep coming back. May's going to be jam-packed. June's going to be jam-packed. Chris, thank you so much, as always, for coming aboard and helping us out. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Really appreciate it.
All right. Cheers. That'll end it for today, guys. Thanks for joining Beyond Compliance. Have a great day.